The year is 1981. The Reagan administration wanted to slash the budget by any means necessary with its proposed economic recovery program. One startling cut gains national traction, authorizing the United States Department of Agriculture's Food and Nutrition Service to cut the budget of child nutrition programs, which had already been trimmed by 11% during Jimmy Carter's presidency. School lunch programs served over 36 million children in 94,000 schools, and the budget would drop from $5.66 billion to $4.2 billion. Keep in mind that this cut of $1.46 billion was about the same amount of money the Pentagon spent in federal subsidies for 5 executive dining rooms for military officers. This budget cut translated to smaller portion sizes and increased meal prices during a period of recession. Eligibility requirements were also made stricter, with the threshold for free and reduced lunch making poor families ineligible if they earned over $11,000 a year. Wrote one critic, "Kids who were poor last year aren't anymore." The bill proposed that a condiment such as pickle relish could be credited as a vegetable, in line with new budgets and nutrition standards, to extreme backlash. In what would be called the ketchup as a vegetable controversy, the incident became a symbol of stinginess denounced by critics, Democrats, and parents. Reagan felt the pressure and relented. While ketchup and other condiments were never actually written into law as a vegetable, school lunch prices doubled and student eligibility and participation fell. The killer part is that this proposed budget cut was announced the same day that news outlets revealed that First Lady Nancy Reagan dropped an astonishing $210,000 on a 4,370-piece china set for the White House. That's over $630,000 in today's money. Though she used private yet tax-refundable donations for the china and other expensive renovations to the White House, the optics of a movie star turned president's wife spending luxuriously while her husband and his administration desired to gut programs that helped improve poor people's quality of life did not go unnoticed by those paying attention. Nor did the assortment of Hollywood stars and VIPs invited to luxurious parties hosted at the White House, only last seen by the JFK administration. In the decades since Reagan's reign, he has been mythologized as a man who saved the economy, made new millionaires, created new homeowners, solved unemployment, and championed the middle class, while advancing the conservative Republican cause of shrinking the government. What's real and what's fake? When Reagan ran for re-election in 1984, he proclaimed that it's morning again in America, telling voters that he had made the economic woes of the 70s disappear and that they had gotten back to living their lives. It was a decade of new technology, new professions, and new ways to spend money. More people seemed to be living better than ever before, but was it morning again for everybody? Who would benefit from this new day? Who would be sacrificed? And what was the wide-reaching impact? In this episode of Lexual Does the 80s, we'll be discussing the rich and poor under Reaganomics.
Who wants to be a Republican?
He, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right.
Come on, shake your body, baby, do that conga.
They call them the cocaine cowboys. Estimates are that as many as 100,000 illegal Colombian aliens are living and working the drug trade in South Florida.
Few unions that endorsed Reagan in the 1980 elections were the 13,000 members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO. Reagan had even sent a letter to the president of PATCO saying, "I pledge to you that my administration will work very closely with you." So in 1981, when PATCO went on strike to get a 32-hour work week, a $10,000 pay increase, and better retirement benefits, they believe Reagan would be on their side. By the way, that $10,000 pay increase would be on top of the $38,000 to $50,000 per year they already made, or about $115,000 to $152,000 today. The union had just negotiated for higher pay, but rejected the Federal Aviation Administration's offer because it didn't reduce weekly hours. It was $40 million instead of the requested $600 million. Strikers cited the tremendous stress of being the lawman of the sky as one of the main reasons for needing more money.
However, Professional Airways System Specialist Union President Larry Henry charges the equipment in the radar room is not being maintained properly.
The main problem? Their standing as federal employees prohibited them from striking. Plus, people thought they already made enough money. On August 3, 1981, PATCO declared a strike anyways. Reagan replied by giving them 48 hours to return to work or be fired, with the additional kicker of never being able to be rehired by the government again. 1,300 union members broke the strike and returned to work.
I would like to thank the supervisors and controllers who are on the job today, helping to get the nation's air system operating safely. In the New York area, for example, 4 supervisors were scheduled to report for work, and 17 additionally volunteered. At National Airport, a traffic controller told a news person he had resigned from the union and reported to work because, quote, "How can I ask my kids to obey the law if I don't?"
Before firing them, Reagan called the demands of the remaining striking PATCO members an unfair tax burden to fellow citizens, ironically mentioning that he respected the right of workers in the private sector to strike, while he and his administration fought tirelessly to deregulate businesses so they could in fact crush unions in the private sector. PATCO's failed strike and Reagan's response signaled that union power was a thing of the past. Contemporary polls showed the general public approving of Reagan's choice, with over 50% of respondents agreeing with his choice. Reported the Pew Research Center. Just 28% said air traffic controllers should be permitted to strike, while 68% said they should not. Even among those in households with a union member, just 40% said the controllers should be allowed to strike. Shortly after firing the PATCO workers, Reagan defended his budget and tax cuts to the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners, telling him that his spending cuts were hardly cruel and inhuman deprivation. There was no applause for this statement. So what about these budget cuts? At the dawn of the 80s, there was a huge deficit, something that would increase throughout Reagan's presidency, peaking at $200 billion. No president had balanced the budget in 12 years. Reagan wanted to cut federal spending, and therefore the budget, by approximately $48 billion. Spending for programs like Medicare and Social Security were 48% of the budget, while military defense spending was over 25%. As made clear in episode 1, Reagan's nosy and destructive foreign policy was his main priority. National debt composed another 10% of the budget, meaning roughly 80% of the budget was impossible to cut. So, budget cuts were reserved for smaller, Great Society programs that benefited the poor and minorities.
Over 90% of black students, those who attend black institutions as well as those who attend predominantly white institutions, depend upon federal assistance. Over 90%. So any cutback in funding for grants and student loan programs or whatever will be devastating.
Reagan signed his budget package in March 1981. The slightly altered version of the budget plans cut spending by $35 billion and was adopted by Congress in May. Along with cutting funds for the Child Nutrition Program, the budget cut funding for Medicaid, student aid, small business loans, and veteran benefits. These programs were popular among wide swaths of Americans, and though Americans hated paying taxes, they loved the programs that the taxes provided. Kevin Phillips pointed out that Americans are hostile to the rich and to big businesses at the same time as they dislike minorities and the liberal politicians who seem to favor minority interests over the working class. Reaganomics prioritized new federalism, or shifting social service responsibility to the state level, and privatization, or less government spending by shifting services to the for-profit private sector. But Phillips warned that liberalism, or belief in big government social programs, was still a pernicious threat to conservative goals of new federalism and privatization. Meanwhile, Reagan's main domestic priority was getting Congress to approve of supply-side economics, in which he claimed tax cuts for the wealthy would benefit society with investments and spending that would trickle down to the lower class. Reagan used an anecdote from his Hollywood days, saying, "When I was in the movies, I'd reach a point each year where after the second movie, I'd be in the 90% bracket. So I just wouldn't make any more movies that year." And it wasn't just me, but Bogert and Gable and others did the same. We weren't the ones who were hurt. The people who worked the props and the people who worked the yard, they were the ones who were hurt. Reaganomics believers insisted there was a war against the rich and that they needed to be catered to and encouraged to invest to fix the economy and poverty and all that other shit. Hence the push for a lower tax rate on personal income and capital gains. To get the tax cuts passed, Reagan would need the support of the public as well as 47 conservative Southern Democrats like Phil Gramm in the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. David Stockman, the newly appointed director of the Office of Management and Budget, informed congressmen on his plan to starve the beast. This starve the beast strategy had been conceived of by Irving Kristol, the father of neoconservatism, who proposed slashing taxes and then reimposing fiscal discipline on Democratic administrations who would have to tidy up afterward. Along with corporate lobbyists and new right activists like Milton Friedman, the pressure to pass the Economic Recovery Tax Act was on. Friedman, who since the 60s had been publishing stingy economic theories based on personal achievement, published the best-selling Free to Choose with his wife Rose in 1980. PBS even aired a 10-part television series based on the book, showing that conservative economic values were being shown to and accepted by mainstream Americans, even those who grew up benefiting from New Deal and Great Society programs. Free to Choose promoted the free market, bemoaned welfare, and advocated for school vouchers. You know, the usual. Individual advancement and personal achievement were key components of getting people to accept the budget and tax cuts, phrases people used when they complained about blacks and immigrants getting their share of economic relief. Conservative and moderate Democrats were further pressured to approve of Reagan's tax cuts after an infamous assassination attempt by John Hinckley Jr., in a deranged attempt to woo the affections of teenage actress Jodi Foster.
He was wounded. My God. The president was hit. He is in stable condition. All this information, the president was hit.
Just 70 days into term, Reagan came within 2 minutes of dying at the hospital due to blood loss, and 2 staff members and a cop were also shot and injured. Press Secretary James Brady was permanently disabled as a result. It's worth noting that it had only been 18 years since the assassination of the last president, a memory that for many patriotic Americans was still fresh. The White House played up Reagan's hospital bed charm, where he asked all the medical personnel before surgery if they were all Republicans. It cannot be overstated how much the assassination attempt would serve to mitigate criticisms of Reagan's choices throughout the rest of the decade. What happened to Reagan on Monday is the stuff of which legends are made, wrote David Broder for the Washington Post. Before the shooting, Reagan had 74% approval from Republicans, 38% approval from Democrats, and 53% approval from independents. After the shooting, Reagan had 92% Republican approval, 51% Democrat approval, and 70% independent approval. After weeks of recovery that still included work and photo ops, Reagan was welcomed back by Congress with a 3-minute standing ovation at the end of April. The tax recovery bill sailed through the House in May and passed in the Senate in late July with the support of hella Democrats breaking ranks, including one guy named Joe Biden. Reagan signed the bill into law in August. The Omnibus Reconciliation Act also cut federal income and business taxes by 25%, just 5% shy of the 30% that Reagan originally asked for. Capital gains taxes were also cut, making investments more appealing to the wealthy. And for the lower class, the Washington Post detailed, the scope of the changes is reflected in the following rough administration and congressional estimates. In the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, the Basic Welfare program, 400,836 families will be cut off the rolls, and another 528,000 will have benefits reduced. In the food stamp program, 875,000 families will be dropped from the program, and 1.4 million households, or 5 million people, will have benefits reduced. But it's okay, right? Shit would trickle down, right? In 1981, 35 states had a stock of 500 million total pounds of subsidized cheese and other dairy products. After a 1977 Carter policy invested $2 billion in the dairy industry within 4 years, dairy farmers overproduced because the government purchased what farmers couldn't sell and turned it into butter, cheese, and dehydrated milk powder. But in 1981, a lot of it was beginning to go bad. After many public complaints that the cheese should go to the needy, Reagan established the Temporary Emergency Food Assistance Program to give out 30 million pounds to the elderly and low income, with California being the first state to receive cheese from the surplus. Government cheese itself had been around since the World War II era, but 1981 was the first year it was directly given away for free. The first giveaways were often late and usually moldy. Eventually, 300 million pounds were given out. To qualify, a family of 4 had to earn under $15,630 a year. Single people living on less than $7,970 a year also could get a slice. But as Vice put it, 75% of African Americans, 51% of Latinos, and 80% of Asian Americans are lactose intolerant versus the 21% of Caucasians. And because minorities historically have been heavily represented in welfare programs, the government wasn't really doing Americans' butts a favor. People took what they could get though. Why were so many people making such meager amounts?
Tonight on Frontline, a generation of American children is being raised in poverty.
Do you have any money at all today? None at all.
1 out of 4 children in this country is poor. They are sick.
This baby has been home for more than 2 weeks. He has developed an infection.
They are hungry.
Do you have other food in the house?
They need more help than the government can give. What future do they have? Tonight, growing up poor.
In the Midwest and South, American farmers were feeling the burn. The state of Minnesota alone lost over 10,000 farms. For starters, farm debt had doubled to $215 billion in 1984, caused by high production numbers and faltering foreign exports. Improved food production and technology via the Green Revolution in India and other countries across the world meant more competition for American farmers. In 1980, a trade embargo enacted by Jimmy Carter against the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan caused a backup of exports. Farmers were angry with Reagan, who implied on the campaign trail that he would lift the embargo when elected. Farmers who already owed massive piles of debt were crushed by the recession impacting everyone else. New policies by the Federal Reserve caused farmland value to drop 60% in some parts of the Midwest between 1981 and 1985. On top of all of that, there were 2 terrible droughts in 1983 and 88. There were tons of farm foreclosures, and local populations began to migrate as agricultural towns closed factories, businesses, and banks. Government services in these areas dropped and schools closed. The misfortune spread to cities where farm supply manufacturers laid off workers. To put it in terms of a human toll, over 900 farmers died by suicide in the Midwest during the 1980s. 2 bankers were even murdered by a father-son team in 1983 when they realized their farm was going under. In 85, the Farm Aid Annual Benefit Concert was established by Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, and Neil Young, where they and other music stars performed before a crowd of 80,000 in Illinois.
Now, live for Farm Aid and a concert for America, here's Willie Nelson.
In 86, Congress passed the Family Farmer Bankruptcy Act, which helped reduce debt and interest rates to keep families on farms. In 87, Reagan lifted the grain embargo against the Soviet Union, sending exports back up. Farmland values were also creeping back up and farming technology was improving. The crisis would ease by the end of the decade, but the agricultural industry was forever changed. The changes in various industries were apparent and impacting everyone at all levels. In 1983, the New York Times reported the sullen fallen hopes of some college graduates, writing that more than 900,000 of them have discovered they must put aside college days dreams and settle for jobs that do not require a degree if they want to work at all. After a sharp rise of computer science degrees and jobs in the late 70s, the job availability peaked in 1984 and would continue to decline for the next 10 years. For the blue-collar workers, many of the remaining factories were modernizing and thinning their workforces. Noted experts in 1984, previously in a more stable competitive environment, U.S. manufacturing companies would lay off workers with the least seniority in a downturn and reemploy them when economic conditions improved. Now, companies were much more likely to shutter whole plants. The industry doing the most hiring was suddenly service, including retail store associates, restaurant staff, and non-medical staff in hospitals and nursing facilities for the growing elderly population. These were jobs where union power was nil and the wages were abominable. By 1990, just over 3/4 of all jobs were in the service sector, especially in malls and fast food.
Working the grill, Bill, it ain't so tough. But first of all, you got to check your stuff. Like a grill that's set at 250 with the meat and cheese that's ready to go. A towel to keep your station looking cool. But most of all, you got to have your tool. Are you with me now? Get ready. We're gonna lay them down. Now, beats got grain to it just like wood. You got to follow the arrow to lay it down like you should. From the front to the back, you got to lay it down. Space it evenly, not scattered around. Next, you got to salt the meat from the back to the front to make the taste complete. Not too little, not too much. With a little finesse, you'll get the touch.
Interestingly, the fastest growing segment of the retail trade were radio, TV, and music stores. Contrary to the popular belief that everyone who was on welfare or desired it were lazy freeloaders who didn't want to work, the decision to work for pennies in service and potentially being ineligible for welfare that you definitely needed was not an easy one. A 1984 profile described a working mother's plight thusly. She loses both the welfare and Medicaid coverage if she and her son keep their jobs. If she chooses to quit her job, she would qualify for a $516 monthly welfare payment, an amount roughly equal to or exceeding her family's actual take-home income after expenses. Or her son could quit work and the family would qualify for a smaller welfare payment. With the welfare payment, however, would come a return to the Medicaid program with full medical coverage and eligibility to receive up to $250 in food stamp benefits. By any strict accounting standard, it is to her advantage to quit work and go on welfare, a choice she does not, in fact, intend to make. Something that often goes undiscussed is how the 1981 budget restricted welfare eligibility, setting asset limits for needy families at $1,000. This means that saving more than $1,000 made you ineligible for welfare, even though $1,000 was not enough to live off or invest on. Unsurprisingly, people receiving welfare would blow through their savings instead of stacking up substantial amounts of cash. And yes, this problem continued long after Reagan left office. The hard choices that poor Americans would have to make took place among a backdrop of ableism, racism, and misogyny, and threading all of these things together, classism and a hatred of the poor. In 1980, an asshole named Bob Johnson published the Public Assistance Board Game, the tagline being, "Why work for a living?" The Baltimore Sun described that the welfare recipient starts off with $500 and gets more for each illegitimate child. The working person starts off with a $150 paycheck. The welfare recipient tries to stay out of work. The working person tries to keep out of the poorhouse. It further summarized, board spaces offer instructions such as hit sub shop, collect $50, and special sexual favor for police chief, collect $300. Others suggest lie on job application, buy case of wine, and snowstorm immobilizes police, loot $2,000. The game brought the outrage of the NAACP, National Organization for Women, and other groups, making many stores stop selling it, but not before 135,000 copies of the board game were purchased. While his administration grappled with a $100 million deficit, Reagan targeted welfare as a system rife with waste and fraud. During a meeting with senators, he told a blatantly fictional tale about a young man going into a grocery store and buying an orange with a food stamp and taking the change from the stamp to buy vodka. vodka. Change from food stamp purchases were no more than 99 cents, and it wasn't even possible to buy a bottle of vodka with 99 cents, assuming the orange was like a penny. This is one of the many instances in politics where welfare, like many things, was not discussed honestly. Instead of discussing wages not keeping up with cost of living, welfare recipients were stereotyped as lazy Americans who just needed to work.
I think a lot of our families don't stress education starting from the very young. There are no role models for the children to see. They see their parents receiving welfare checks. They don't see their children, they don't see their parents going out every morning to a job and bringing in a paycheck to pay for their various needs. So therefore they feel, well, if my mother can feed 7 children and we're not doing that bad, we're still living, well, why should I go out and get an education, finish school, and try to look for a job?
In the decades prior, Chester had been at the center of racist corruption scandals that left residents, predominantly black, in dire straits. In the 80s, Chester was one of many deindustrialized towns reeling from few job opportunities, dwindling public resources, and environmental racism in addition to crime. The city had even erected a toxic trash incinerator and a sewage plant in a prison.
Kids is something like that, I might sell drugs for a while, pay them, make a good 10 grand, put it in the bank, right, and all that. Put the money in the bank, and I think that lasts me much good to pay the rent, feed my children for a while. If I have to sell drugs to survive, I don't have to do it.
It's wrong selling drugs because it's against the law, but I still do it anyway because I want to. And because nobody can stop me out in the street from selling drugs except the cops if I get caught.
Of course, all of this generational and systemic context was missing from the documentary. The coded language about welfare was directed towards black Americans, especially due to the haunting specter of the racist welfare queen stereotype. By 1987, the black unemployment rate was double that of whites. Black people were often among the first to lose their jobs when factories or businesses shuttered. But there's more. Because Reagan cut aid to cities and cities returning towards the private sector, cities cut their budgets and had massive layoffs. Many of the affected jobs were held by black people, who held a large proportion of municipal jobs. These issues and a bunch of other stuff we'll get into in the next episode were rarely addressed when the welfare problem was discussed. Instead, poverty was presented as a personal moral issue made worse by bleeding heart liberals. In 1984, Charles Murray, white supremacist economist and member of conservative think tank the Manhattan Institute, published Losing Ground, a scathing bestseller that emphasized that welfare, soft approaches to crime, and changes to education were creating incentives to fail. 40 states would set up welfare-to-work programs throughout the decade, and the Family Support Act of 1988 took this to a national level, directing states to implement education and job training and placement programs by 1990. The effectiveness of these programs would be dubious. As mentioned, Losing Ground attacked newfound approaches to crime as a major issue. Crime had been on the rise since the 60s, but peaked in the 1980s, with rates of violent crime growing an average of 5% annually.
Fact. There is a burglary every 8 seconds. Fact. There is a robbery every 58 seconds. Fact. There is an aggravated assault every 48 seconds. Fact. A forcible rape occurs every 6 minutes. Fact. 1 out of 3 homes is burglarized each year. That is a cause for alarm.
There was a rise in guard dog purchases, iron bars for windows, floodlights, and gated communities. It was during this decade that spending on private neighborhood patrols rose to $500 million. For the individual peace of mind, over $2 billion was spent on home burglar alarms.
It is the AmGuard Perimeter Alarm, a high-technology, low-cost method of protecting your home and property by providing the things burglars fear most: loud noises and bright lights, before they ever get in your home or apartment or business.
In cities like Detroit and Youngstown, prosecuted crimes for survival helped aid light city coffers. Drugs tore through the streets, making quick bucks appealing for some of the 20 to 30 million unemployed. While most urban areas were feeling their fair share of crime, Miami stood out for a number of reasons in the first half of the 1980s. Yes, let's talk about the city that inspired the new wave, darkly glamorous series Miami Vice. At the time, Miami was the youngest major city, incorporated less than a century before in 1896. In the early 80s, it was ranked 28th in a commercial real estate poll assessing its potential for establishing businesses. The city, which was 75% white in 1960, was rapidly becoming a minority majority. Beginning with Nicaragua in 1979, wealthy families from El Salvador, Venezuela, Guatemala, and Argentina began putting approximately $4 billion in exile money in Miami banks in preparation for the fall of their respective governments. By 1987, the population of Miami was only 15% Anglo, with the rest being Cuban, Haitian, Salvadoran, Venezuelan, Guatemalan, Argentinian, Jamaican, Puerto Rican, and Black. The mix of non-Anglo culture frightened investors, along with the many language barriers. Secondly, the city was on an economic downturn, with wages 40% lower than the national average and over 20,000 condos sitting empty despite extreme price decreases. Lastly, the city was crawling with cartel violence and drug smuggling and had been since the 70s, impacting both tourism and the aforementioned real estate.
They call them the Cocaine Cowboys. Yesterday, they struck busy Dadeland shopping mall shortly after 2, executing 2 Latin males in the Crown Liquor Store, hitting 2 employees and spraying the parking lot with bullets. Innocent bystanders dove for cover. Cars were riddled with machine gun fire, gas tanks spilling out, smashed glass and liquor bottles flying.
By the way, Miami's drug trade made more money than Miami's legitimate real estate and tourist trades. 1,600 miles away, cocaine had become Colombia's #1 export, surpassing coffee thanks to the Medellin cartel. The powerful drug ring had consolidated power thanks to the leadership of Pablo Escobar. A 1980 FBI report listed Miami as the #1 most crime-ridden city, with the highest murder rate and an estimated 70% of all imported coke and weed smuggled through South Florida, thanks to so-called cocaine cowboys.
The murder rate has shot up 70%. The head of Miami's Police Benevolent Association has warned that the criminal justice system can no longer protect the public and urged people to arm themselves. This holiday season in Miami, people have been giving guns to the ones they love. Year-round sales are up nearly 40%, 700 handguns registered in one day. Some South Floridians are calling home Dodge City.
The city itself was complicit in the drug corruption and violence. During the recession, the drug trade provided demand for approximately 25,000 legitimate jobs in banking, real estate construction, and the service industry. In 1980, Miami had a record 573 murders, with many confirmed to be drug-related. The same year it was reported, $108 million in the city's banks were traced to drug suspects. The Miami-Dade morgue was so overwhelmed with bodies that it rented a refrigerated truck from Burger King and would continue using it for 7 years. In 1981, it was reported that approximately 40 of Miami's 250 banks were not reporting cash deposits of $10,000 or more as the law dictated. Additionally, drug dealers could pay and skip out on bail with ease. America and Colombia agreed on a bilateral extradition treaty in which Colombia would send suspected Colombian drug traffickers to the United States for trial, where they had little power or influence. The cartel responded in the years to come with bombings, kidnappings, murders, and more to put pressure on the Colombian government to stop the extradition treaty. In 1982, $100 million worth of cocaine was seized from a Miami International Airport hangar, triggering Reagan to create the South Florida Drug Task Force. 4 years later, the Village Voice evaluated the program, saying, since its inception in 1982, the federal South Florida Crime Task Force has racked up more than 9,500 arrests, seized tons of drugs. The result? Drugs are more available than ever before and cheaper by half at $30,000 a kilo. Few street-level dealers are ever touched because the courts and jails are jammed. Crack houses operate openly almost everywhere. And the big dealers, the importers and wholesalers, are virtually immune in their Brickell Avenue condos and Coral Gables mansions. The drug business is a very successful American enterprise. Everybody knows this. Ordinary citizens, reporters, politicians, school children. The same article discussed the levels of corruption among the city's politicians and businessmen. Another article delved into the rise of cocaine use among the populace. One mid-level dealer recalled, "An 8-ball was worth $350 and everyone knew that. My dentist always took coke for his work. I got my hair cut for half a gram, rented speedboats for 2 8-balls, bought clothes with grams. If you had coke, almost everyone took it as payment." Even still, coke was an expensive drug. It wouldn't be long before a new addition would dominate the streets with a more high-profile supplier. In early 1980, the Internal Revenue Service reported that tax shelter activity was threatening the system and shorting the government out of billions of dollars of revenue. Nearly 200,000 individual returns represented 18,000 shelter schemes, and many were clogged up in examination and appeals. Between 1980 and 1982, tax shelter cases that made it to court tripled from 5,000 to 15,000. A 1983 report said that the practice was spreading from the rich to the middle class. Jerome Kurtz, who had been appointed Commissioner of Internal Revenue by Jimmy Carter, wished to end policies that benefited wealthy taxpayers. He warned the great abuse could result in a serious decline in taxpayers' perception of the fairness and even-handedness of our administration of the tax system, and consequently in the level of voluntary compliance. Reagan insisted that his tax-cutting program would curb the use of shelters, implying that when given the opportunity to make more money, the super wealthy would be like super honest. But this contrasted with literally everything we know about the super wealthy, especially in the 80s. And people were getting super wealthy in the 80s, particularly in the stock market after deregulation and the cut in the capital gains tax. The money seemed to be endless.
It could be there one minute, he said change next minute. You have to get the change in right away. So if you don't and they get you, then you lose the money.
91.6.
SocGen New York, dollar Paris, and 22.
Towards the top of the food chain was Wall Street titan Ivan Boesky, a stock trader who made hundreds of millions in corporate takeovers and inspired media profiles and careers. And of course, Michael Milken, who made over $1 billion selling junk bonds to unsuspecting middle Americans through his unscrupulous firm, Drexel Burnham Lambert.
Back in the 1980s, I was the toast of Wall Street. I was having whiskey with Boesky and cookies with Milken.
Small companies and major corporations as big as Gulf Oil were raided and destroyed in hostile takeovers by men like T. Boone Pickens.
Everyone's fired and we're out of business.
No!
I'm going to sell Planet Express to Mom so she can gut the company and eliminate us as competitors.
Don't let the door hit you on the way out, because I don't want ass prints on my new door.
These men and others were amalgamated into Gordon Gecko, the heartless king of greed in 1987's Wall Street.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
It shouldn't be lost on any of you that New York was often a central component of 1980s excess and wealth inequality, especially when we discuss crime in the city in future episodes. Another famous New Yorker I'll bring up wasn't a Wall Street fat cat, but instead a hotel queen. Leona Helmsley, also known as the Queen of Mean, was a popular figure in the early 80s. She was married to real estate investor and broker Harry B. Helmsley, who boasted a $5 billion net worth. He had divorced his wife of 33 years to marry Leona. Goddamn, girl. And just a few years later, he made her the head of Helmsley Hotels in 1980. The company owned 30 hotels around the country. Her entire shtick was being mean and abusive to employees, with ads declaring, "Say what you will, she runs a hell of a hotel." Papers reported on their luxury penthouse overseeing Central Park, which hosted an annual I'm Just Wild About Harry party, featuring caviar, champagne, gardenias in the pool. And they had a $4 million jet, a Palm Beach penthouse, and other prerequisites of expensive taste. Something tells me we'll be back to Mrs. Helmsley by the end of the episode.
He must have lost to Mondale in '84.
Bingo. 47 days into his presidency, Mondale handed complete control of the U.S. over to the Soviet Union.
I guess that explains the statue.
There was a short period when people thought Reagan was going to be a one-term president, especially congressional Democrats. In 1982, a recession seemed to show that supply-side economics were a failure. Unemployment was up to 10%, meaning 30 million people were unemployed all or part of the year. Over 16 million Americans lost health insurance through Medicaid, and over 1 million poor kids felt the brunt of those slashed budgets as they lost access to free lunch. Democrats called it the Reagan recession, and his popularity rating slipped to 44% in May 1982. Meanwhile, serious social conservatives wondered how the tax and budget cuts would deal with or extend to abortion, busing, and school prayer. Reagan barely addressed these issues, causing Elizabeth Dole to write to close Reagan advisors Edwin Meese and James Baker in 1982. Our conservative supporters are raising the question, where's the president when it's our turn at bat? I doubt she told the conservative supporters that the Gipper was often watching movies, memorizing well-crafted speeches, cue cards, and schedules contrived by dutiful aides, and reportedly blowing off policy briefs. In the 1982 midterm elections, Democrats did well in areas hit hardest by the recession, where constituents blamed the newly implemented Reaganomics for their shift in fortune. This is despite the fact that from 1980 to 1981, Republicans outraised Democrats $132 million to $17 million for campaign funds. Republicans lost 26 House seats that year. There is no Reagan revolution, declared a New York Times reporter. Reagan, meanwhile, appointed a bipartisan committee to analyze Social Security solvency as cash stores were low. The committee recommended that Reagan should increase payroll taxes, which happened along with a gas tax hike in 1983. The average American was paying the same taxes as before Reagan's big tax cut, while wealthy Americans and their capital gains were sitting pretty. But the budget deficit was dangerously high, so Senator Bob Dole led a bipartisan effort to undo about one-third of Reagan's tax cuts with the August 1982 Tax Equity and Responsibility Act. It increased business taxes and excise taxes on tobacco, alcohol, communications, and airlines, pissing off neoconservatives. In October 1983, 63% of 350 polled conservative leaders considered themselves disappointed with the Reagan presidency, charging his administration as being bursting with moderates still addicted to government spending. To some of these conservatives, his first major blunder had been Reagan's choice for the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. She was the first woman to fill the position, and though conservative, did not agree with eliminating abortion access completely. Conservative voices like Richard Viguerie warned Reagan that you cannot continue to side with the liberal establishment without causing millions who worked for you to see you as just another politician bending to the pressures from the Washington crowd. While feeling the need to appease the ultra-conservatives and pro-lifers who made up a considerable portion of his support, Reagan's administration wanted to prioritize its stingy economic goals and achievements for neoconservatives, libertarians, and centrists because it understood that focusing too much on religious morality and therefore radical conservatives would alienate Americans in the middle. Let's recall the demographics of the electorate in 1984. Approximately 20% was liberal, 36% was conservative, and 42% were middle of the road. As Reagan campaign press secretary Jim Lake put it, no one would focus on the amount of new jobs that have been created by entrepreneurs encouraged by the Reagan tax cuts if we focus instead on the amount of fetuses aborted. So to ensure his victory in the 1984 election, Ronnie the Gipper took the life is good, aren't you glad this isn't the smelly 70s approach, attracting middle-of-the-road voters and placating his conservative base.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
How did this this approach measure against the Democratic nominees. There was Walter Mondale, mainstream liberal from Minnesota who served as Carter's vice president. There was little-known Colorado Senator Gary Hart, who wanted to build a progressive majority of college students, professionals, and independent voters. His upset victory in the New Hampshire primaries was big news, with Hart winning 37% of the vote to Mondale's 28%. Also making big news was Jesse Jackson, the second black person after Shirley Chisholm to run for president, though his gender and support network made him a more serious contender. He won the primaries in South Carolina, Virginia, and Louisiana, ultimately finishing third overall behind Gary Hart and Walter Mondale. His use of an anti-Semitic slur on the campaign trail was widely publicized and caused irrevocable damage. Jesse Jackson also presented ideas that were characterized as too radical, like cutting the Department of Defense budget by up to 15%, supporting Palestine, providing reparations for descendants of the enslaved, and creating a single-payer system of universal health care. Even still, Jackson would try his luck with better results in 1988. So, the 1984 primaries really came down to Hart and Mondale. Hart accused Mondale of being beholden to special interests like union workers, black people, women, etc., seizing on a growing attitude that Mondale's brand of liberalism was elite favoritism towards minorities. Hart presented himself as a man with new and fresh ideas. At a 1984 debate, Hart was criticized by Mondale for not offering substantial policy proposals, mocking him with the slogan of a popular Wendy's commercial at the time.
When I hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef? Yeah. Where's the beef?
Wendy's kind of people never ask, where's the beef?
Even though Mondale would win the Democratic primaries, he was not necessarily popular. When Mondale announced his female vice president running mate, it reinforced public perception of him being captive to special interest groups. His selection was Geraldine Ferraro, a New York Democratic representative who was popular in the party. She heavily dealt in legislation concerning women and the elderly. Though attractive to white women, she alienated men.
I'm a little bit redneck that way. I just believe it's a little early yet for a woman to be vice president.
Let me just say, first of all, that I almost resent Vice President Bush, your patronizing attitude that you have to teach me about foreign policy. I've been a member of Congress for 6 years. I was there when the embassy was held hostage in Iran, and I have been there and I have seen what has happened in the past several months, 17 months with your administration.
Unlike her male counterparts, Ferraro must seem strong without being harsh. At the Chula Vista Police Department, for instance, when she chided officials for the lack of female officers.
Tell me about the women in this department. How many women are you? 5 out of how many? 99. Oh, yeah, that's not so hot.
As an Italian Catholic, Ferraro's pro-choice stance turned off Catholics.
While Ferraro was inside joking about affirmative action, outside protesters were not joking. Right-to-life supporters are angry with Ferraro's pro-choice stance on abortion.
Mondale himself turned off voters of all kinds when he said during his acceptance speech at the DNC, "Mr. Reagan will raise taxes and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did." This was true, as Reagan himself would raise taxes 11 times during his time in office whenever the cash flow was thin. But people wanted to be lied to about taxes and government spending. While Reagan's nostalgic and positive campaign wanted to wrap Americans in a hug, one observer described his ads as placebos, Mondale chose a different approach. Jumping on Democratic fears, he attacked Reagan's foreign policy in Central America and the Middle East, seized on fears about a mounting nuclear arms race, warned about an abandoned middle class, and discussed the rise in poverty. He supported an arm freeze and the Equal Rights Amendment. In addition to his ideas, which alienated the conservative-leaning majority, Walter Mondale lacked personality and charm. Reagan, an actor and Hollywood veteran, relied on carefully composed broadcasts and PR in a way that Mondale didn't. For instance, Reagan's meeting with Michael Jackson for a drunk driving program in 1984 was widely publicized and something Walter Mondale could never pull off. Just 5 months earlier, Michael Jackson had dropped Thriller and was officially the most famous entertainer in the world. world. In the celebrity-obsessed, TV-loving culture that flourished in the 1980s, Reagan's grandfatherly image and Hollywood connections spoke the loudest to middle-of-the-road voters who couldn't be bothered with details. This was made even clearer in 1986 when 60 million people turned in to watch Reagan on Barbara Walters' TV show, a number that dwarfed the 1 million people who read the most popular newspaper daily. For many, image mattered more than issues, and TV was the key. For those who did care about issues, Reagan spoke the familiar conservative jive of the 70s: smaller government, family values, spending cuts on damned minorities, and not backing down against the evil empire. During the first presidential debate, Mondale challenged Reagan's assertion of it being morning again in America, saying, "The president's favorite question is, are you better off? Well, if you're wealthy, you're better off. If you're middle income, you're about where you were. And if you're of modest income, you're worse off." That's what the economists tell us. But is that really the question that should be asked? Isn't the real question, will we be better off? Will our children be better off? Are we building the future that this nation needs? Polls would show the majority of Americans believed Mondale won the debate. For one hot moment, Mondale went from loser to an underdog. Observers began to wonder about the mental agility of an aging Reagan who regularly made verbal mistakes. He was even rumored to take naps during cabinet meetings and at summits with the Pope. During the second debate, Reagan found a moment to impart humor and charm.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Mondale would say about the joke, "If TV can tell the truth, as you say it can, you'll see that I was smiling. But I think if you come in close, you'll see some tears coming down because I knew he had gotten me there." That was really the end of my campaign that night, I think. I told my wife the campaign was over. And it was. So, roughly 102 million people, or 53.3% of voting age Americans, participated in the 1984 presidential election. Reagan won 58.8% of that vote and won 525 electoral votes, the most ever.
And there you see the first blue state on the ABC News map.
This is significant for multiple reasons. Nearly half of voting age Americans did not participate at all, reflecting an ongoing trend of decreased voter participation. 58% of eligible black voters participated, up since a sharp decline after 1968. Reagan winning the vote of over half of the eligible voters reflected the country's social and economic conservatism, and in various groups, 55 to 58% of women voted for Reagan. 46% of those living at or below the poverty line voted for Reagan. 58% of those making between $12,500 and $25,000 a year voted for Reagan. For every raise in income, Reagan won a larger share of the vote. 46% of those in a union, despite Reagan's response to PATCO, threw their support behind him. But Mondale's 40% capture of voting age Americans revealed that there was an actual assembly of people who did not feel welcomed in the Reagan Revolution. Only 9% of black Americans voted for Reagan, with the other 91% voting for Mondale, so-called king of special interest minorities. 66% of Hispanic voters supported Mondale. The stunning electoral defeat of a Democrat running on ideas that could hardly be considered radical would stay fresh in Democrat minds for the next decade as they reassessed what it would take to put another Democrat in the White House. Relying on special interest groups, racial minorities, women, etc., could not compete with a white majority and the mainstream distaste for liberal policies. Also showed the third-party vote was at its weakest since 1964, winning just 0.67% of the vote. The Communist Party USA was represented by Gus Hall and Angela Davis for president and vice president, respectively. They won 36,000 votes. Libertarian candidates got 228,000 votes, and other third-party candidates couldn't get more than 80,000 apiece. As we'll discuss in upcoming episodes, a good chunk of Reagan supporters were single-issue moral voters who would place their bets on the guy who most embodied their best chance at bringing godliness back into the American fabric. But Reagan was notably carried by Southern white and Northern blue-collar workers who thought Democrat economic and social spending policies were selling out whites and or the middle class. They not only desperately wished that Reaganomics would restore a familiar order to an America that was increasingly diversifying and attempting to mitigate poverty for minorities, but they desperately believed in it for themselves too, especially those with champagne wishes and caviar dreams. could afford it, the 80s offered unlimited pleasures. The cut in corporate taxes, along with various business incentives, meant innovation and more possibilities. As the public sector declined, Americans witnessed a privatization of their everyday lives. After all, Reagan promoted the idea that the private sector worked better than the government, providing creative, less expensive, and more efficient alternatives to solving our social problems. There were an abundance of private gyms, private schools, and private communities to choose from. Instead of socializing in the town square or local meeting hall, Americans flocked to privately owned malls to shop and bump into other consumers. Malls got bigger than ever before and now served as new civic centers. They contained movie theaters, restaurants, arcades, skating and ice rinks, and even dentist offices. By 1987, there were more malls than cities, four-year colleges, and secondary schools. It was unclear whether or not these were truly public or private spaces. In theory, anyone could show up to a mall and window shop and belong without dropping a dime. You could also show up and communicate new ideas. 1980's Prune Yard Shopping Center versus Robbins decided that mall owners could not outright ban pickets and leaflets from being distributed. But in practice, the hiring of private security and an enforcement of dress codes and arbitrary rules led to a policing of people who didn't fit the mold. Malls were also an exercise in avoiding class problems that plagued an area. For instance, my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina was one of several cities in the 80s that developed skyway malls that placed middle-class office workers and shoppers above the homelessness and crime of the streets. But more simply, many malls were built far from public transportation and benefited from redlining, keeping out undesirable people from cities. Though homelessness in the 80s is an issue I'll come back to in episode 6, it's important to note that a little under 500,000 people did not have permanent homes during the decade. Parks and recreation facilities were stripped of budgets and decaying with crimes, drugs, and homeless people, meaning more private parks and gyms. Libraries had budgetary cutbacks that closed branches and cut hours. Gigantic bookstores stepped in to fill the void. Barnes & Noble and Borders Books, wrote Bruce L. Schulman, filled many of the needs public libraries had previously served with organized readings, children's story hours, and book discussion groups. Still, the stores served suburban shopping centers in affluent urban neighborhoods, meaning immigrant children in the 1980s rarely found their way inside a superstore. Racists fled to private amenities in the wake of desegregation and privatization, not wanting their children attending schools with minorities or swimming in the same pools. They could also put their own pools in backyards. Private communities and recreation sites hired their own security to keep out undesirables. Private communities meant private associations and shadow governments controlled by homeowner associations, growing in popularity in the late 80s and into the 90s. As for cities facing extreme budget cuts, they had a few options. Many closed public bathrooms to save money and keep out undesirables in their activities, expecting businesses to fill the void. Local governments also cut their budgets by contracting basic services to private companies. While public officials struggled with their budgets, a new crop of upper middle class Americans and millionaires coined yuppies enjoyed a lifestyle of consumption. What was there to consume? Over 112,000 new items reached supermarket and drugstore shelves, including new sizes and flavors of existing products. From Diet Coke to Dove bars, many of Americans' favorite pricey junk foods originated in the 80s. Meanwhile, the top grocery chains got fancier, adding deli departments, bakeries, and salad bars. But not everyone had access. While grocery store openings exceeded closings during the decade, urban majority black areas experienced a net loss of grocery stores. For those with access, aisles were bustling with a host of new items. 1983 was the dawn of Hot Pockets, for example. Fitting in with the demand for health and body-conscious meals, there were lean cuisines fat-free and reduced everything, aspartame, oat bran, and fiber. Gourmet food was available for Americans and their pets, with specialty food shops for both groups popping up in areas inhabited by young professionals. Gourmet ice cream was another major moneymaker, with the establishment of Brewster's, Cold Stone Creamery, Marble Lab Creamery, and Dippin' Dots. I hate Dippin' Dots, by the way. During the second half of the 80s, imported foods were up 20%, with moneyed Americans feeling adventurous enough to move past the passé trend of Chinese American and classic French cuisines. Americans ate out more than ever before. For those searching for fine dining experiences that prioritize presentation over taste or portion, there were in abundance. They were shelling out hundreds for plates of foam, mousse, blackened meats, pesto, and more. Towers of food and sushi were also appealing. In major cities like New York and Chicago, this was the beginning of the celebrity chef, and many famous faces got their start during this time. Culinary schools schools grew their enrollment as well. For those on a budget who still wanted the luxury of service, there were over 540 U.S. food chains to choose from by the mid-80s. Factory sales of electronics, meanwhile, jumped from $106 billion in 1980 to $256 billion in 1989. There were photocopiers, fax machines, pagers, camcorders, the Walkman, boom boxes, and even duck phones to indulge in. Disposable cameras, bread-making machines, and more advanced coffee makers surged in popularity. For early computer geeks, there was IBM's groundbreaking personal computer in 1981 and the Macintosh in 1984, which was appealing because of its handy mouse and user-friendly software. Other seductive technology included 1983's Sony CD player, which went for a whopping $1,000 in today's money, and the 1989 Motorola Microtech, which was $3,000 in today's money. It was a smaller and more appealing version of the brick, which hit the market in 1984 for about $9,000 in today's money. Having a car phone or a cell phone of any size was considered a massive flex during the 80s, so much so that an industry of fakes popped up for those dying to fake it.
Love it. Will you roll up my window? I can't hear you. There's some trucks coming by.
She's talking to herself. There's nobody on the other end of the call. This is what the cellular car phone has spawned, a phony car phone. Status without the static. The fake phone sells for $15.95. And Patricia Kwame of Los Altos, California, has already sold 45,000 of them.
Our motto is, it's not what you own, it's what people think you own.
People would talk to themselves and pretend. I'm crying. Even Americans who weren't millionaires desperately wanted to participate in the consumerism and flexing frenzy, and many could. The poverty line by 1980 was at a level of real income that was attained a century ago only by those in the top 10% of income distribution. Plus, poverty, though awful, could come with placating and toxic thrills. During the decade, household debt grew about 50% faster than disposable income to approximately $3.5 trillion. In the early 20th century, borrowing was frowned upon, but after World War II, it became respectable and a sign of personal success. The rise of more middle-class borrowers meant relaxed credit terms. Banks began giving cards to those who were younger, less educated, and in lower income brackets. They could nab themselves Ralph Lauren or Calvin Klein, the most sought-after designers of the decade. They could get the highly coveted Ford Taurus, dropped in 1985, or the Dodge Caravan or Plymouth Voyager Caravans, both introduced in 1983 and rapidly replacing the popularity of station wagons for families. For the funky driver, there was 1988's Mazda Miata. For the consumer who didn't want to leave their home or who wanted to shop when the malls were closed, the Home Shopping Network began as the Home Shopping Club in 1982 on a Florida cable channel.
Take it to a jeweler, take it to a gemologist, have them appraise it, and if they don't tell you it's worth every single penny of $650, you can send it back to us. I don't think that's going to be happening.
QVC began just a year later. It's no wonder that the average amount of bank card debt rose and fewer consumers paid off their debt in full. With a rise in leisurely income and/or debt came a rise in travel. Timeshare ownership grew as shady companies converted failed residential projects into timeshares. With the growth of commercialized airlines, more Americans became comfortable with long-distance travel. The deregulation of the airline industry meant a sharp increase in competition. Airlines like American were in trouble and grappling with massive profit losses. Thinking quickly in 1981, perhaps too quickly, American Airlines sold $250,000 lifetime first-class tickets to 28 people who traveled so much that it would cost the company millions of dollars a year. But most people were hobnobbing in cheap coach seats. They were going to relatively affordable destinations like the less than 20 years independent Jamaica, where tourism was highly desired. Described one travel writer on Jamaica in 1980, round-trip air travel from Chicago or New York to Montego Bay was less than $300. Good seaside lodging for two could be had for $40 a night, and fresh seafood such as lobster or kingfish cost less than the price of a hamburger at certain New York City hotel dining rooms. Resort packages were easily available with a quick call to a travel agent. Travel agents were a booming career as most Americans booked trips through them. Wrote the Christian Science Monitor at the top top of the decade. As airline profits hover uncomfortably close to the ground, travel agent profits seem to be soaring close to the clouds. Over 2 million Americans obsessed with the British royal wedding in 1981 and/or the thriving punk scene of the late 70s spent 784 million euros on trips to London to do things like tour Buckingham Palace. Another popular location for American tourists in Europe was Western Germany, whose status as the island of freedom in the Cold War attracted people who wanted to tour the Berlin Wall. Cruise ships also became highly popular, thanks to the introduction of brand new megaships that offered seemingly endless amenities and fun. Leading the way was the SS Norway, a 1,000-foot ship billing itself as the destination. Who needed tons of port locations when the repurposed ship boasted bars, discos, a casino, live music and shows, television sets in every room, midnight buffets, saunas, whirlpools, and spas.
Most passengers are North Americans, but more and more Europeans too become fond of the Caribbean Sea and of the American way of spending leisure time. US citizens are greatly conscious of leisure time, which certainly has to do with the fact that the annual vacation period in the United States is shorter than that of Europeans, for instance. Time is money still applies to the USA, and whoever tries to purchase the favor of Americans in need of recreation must have very special offers. Luxury has its price, but it's not at all unattainable to the average person.
Wrote the Washington Post in 1980. You can go skeet shooting, take lessons in Chinese cooking, see a movie, enjoy a fashion show, play ping pong, or carve ice. All told, the ship claims to offer 85 activities daily. The SS Norway was quite expensive in its beginning days, with cheap tickets going for about $1,250 or $3,488 in today's money. Meanwhile, the 1983 film Spring Break caused a surge in co-ed visitors to Fort Lauderdale, which was already known for hosting co-eds every spring. Roughly 370,000 college students took annual road trips and flights to Fort Lauderdale in the early 80s before a 1984 federal law increased the drinking age and made Europe and Mexico popular destinations for the moneyed college set. Fort Lauderdale was also pretty pissed at the influx of hard partying and usually cheap young people. The mayor of Fort Lauderdale begged for spring breakers to never return, setting up new restrictive ordinances and even appearing on Good Morning America. Lastly, embodying the high life of the 1980s, celebrity culture was reaching new heights, which we'll come back to in later episodes. But a good example of this for now was the boy builder Donald Trump, whose business flair and luxurious lifestyle was being chronicled with lightning pace in the 1980s. By the time of 1987's Art of the Deal and his continued coverage during the high-stakes 1988 presidential elections, he was a household name. Though in 1980 he was claiming to Tom Brokaw that he didn't care about becoming a billionaire, his greed in pursuit of power was documented in a 1984 GQ profile, which teased to readers and grocery store browsers the towering ambition of Donald Trump. His real estate deals were discussed in the usual way of the 80s callousness towards wealth inequality. Wrote GQ, there are only two types of people who live on Fifth Avenue in Midtown: homeless derelicts who sleep over the hot air grates in front of Saks, and well-groomed members of the cabaret set who prefer to set down roots in a neighborhood where groceries or even a bar of soap are a taxi ride away. The latter have decided to call Trump Towers, 268 condominium apartments, home. In 1986, it was revealed to a shocked and gossipy public that Queen of Mean Leona Helmsley had failed to pay sale taxes in New York on hundreds of thousands of dollars of jewelry, skipping out on at least a $40,000 tax bill. The next year, the New York Post exposed that the Helmsleys had evaded over $4 million in income taxes. According to a former maid, the billionaire hotelier said, "Only the little people pay taxes." The Helmsleys had billed tons of items as business expenses over the years, including lingerie. Girl, I didn't know you was a sex worker. Her 80-year-old husband was found mentally incompetent, so she took the entire fall, ultimately being sentenced to 4 years in prison and fined over $7.1 million for tax fraud. She would eventually only serve 18 months and was ordered to 750 hours of community service, which was reduced. She was sentenced to an additional 150 hours when it was discovered that she had employees complete community service tasks on her behalf. The Leona Helmsley drama played out in the newspapers and tabloids and took place amongst a backdrop of other greedy shit shows. For New York especially, it was kind of hard to keep up. The same year Leona was exposed as a tax fraud, the global stock market crashed on October 19th, aka Black Monday, sending stock prices down for days and triggering fears of a second Great Depression among Wall Street. And just the year before, insider trading scandals were revealed and rocked Wall Street. Tax and securities fraud abounded, and men like Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken were both arrested for corporate crimes involving millions of dollars. Milken's company, Drexel Burnham Lambert, which had made him the highest earning man on Wall Street, ultimately went bankrupt. All the heavy hitters were severely underpunished. For example, Boesky returned $50 million in illegitimate profits and added a $50 million fine. When it was all said and done, he still had a fortune of $100 million left over. Also during this late 80s period, over 1,000 saving and loans banks collapsed, half of them in Texas. Savings and loan banks were started in the 30s to make home ownership easy for white people, with their only source of income being home mortgages. By 1980, S&L banks were losing $4 billion a year. In 1982, Reagan cut funds for the regulation of S&L banks, in addition to making changes that allowed them to issue bad home loans, issue commercial loans, mismanage assets, and lie about their financial status. The crisis would cost $160 billion, with taxpayers covering $132 billion of that, in what would come to be known as the Keating 5 scandal. 5 senators, including Republican prisoner of war John McCain and the Democrat and former astronaut John Glenn, were given money by porn hater Robert Keating, the head of an S&L association, to pressure the underfunded regulatory board into overlooking the association's bad finances. Nobody except Keating was punished. The general 1980s sleaziness even extended to America's TV preachers, involving numerous accusations of theft, fraud, and rape, as covered in this video on televangelism on my channel. Biggest thing that these white-collar crimes had in common was that the perpetrators often faced just a slap on the wrist as a punishment, which paled in comparison to crimes of the predominantly black. During Reagan's landslide 1984 campaign that we discussed earlier, he name-dropped Bruce Springsteen in the singer's home state of New Jersey during a speech. Springsteen's Born in the USA was one of the 5 best-selling albums of the year. Clueless Reagan staffers who thought the album was a sappy love letter to patriotism, meant to rally freedom fighters against communism, a big government, and undesirables who clashed with family values, slipped the singer's name into his speech. But Bruce Springsteen wrote the titular song about working-class men who fought in Vietnam and came home to economic hardships. The album dealt with similar subject matter, and the patriotism of the song and the album is ironic. So name-dropping Springsteen was hilarious. After all, Reagan had cut benefits for veterans. The key thing to remember about Reaganomics, no matter your political affiliation, is that only the top 20% of American families made gains while the rest of the population declined and stagnated. As Walter Mondale had asked, would we be better off? Definitely not, if the majority continued to prioritize business interests over those of poor individuals. Together in 1986, Democrats and Republicans created the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which lowered the corporate tax rate. Would we be better off? The vicious wealth inequality enabled and seeded for future blooming by the Reagan administration, Republicans, and conservative Democrats would have devastating consequences coming up in future episodes. And a large proportion of Black America would feel the brunt of those devastating consequences. But there's more to the story. The next episode of Lexual Does the 80s, we'll be doing a deep dive on Black American life during the Reagan years. If you're loving Lexual Does the 80s and want to be listed in the credits, please subscribe to my Patreon at the $25 and up level. You can also get sources and further reading over there for just $1 a month. The link is in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.